Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on the issues relating to genetic modification. This is part of our Module 6 Part 3 series on manipulating genomes, and what we're looking at in this particular video is specification reference 6.1.3H, the ethical issues, both positive and negative, relating to the genetic manipulation of animals, including humans, plants and microorganisms. So let's start off with our animals then. If we think of one example of a genetically modified animal that we use quite frequently, we've got genetically modified mice. Now, these genetically modified mice are quite often bred for medical research programs. And what we're able to do there is develop a range of therapies for things like cancers that we're obviously able to test on these mice and therefore develop better treatments for humans. We can also use these GM mice where we've knocked out certain genes to actually identify what they do. So if these mice happen to have a gene that's in common with us, for example, we can knock it out of the mice, see what happens to them, and therefore gain an understanding of what that gene does. In terms of the risks or hazards of using these GM mice, then the main one that we come back to is the animal welfare debate. So all of these genetically modified mice used in research are obviously going to be kept in labs, and we need to be mindful of how they're treated. Now, obviously the UK has a lot of strict regulations about the welfare of animals that are used in medical research, and therefore they're quite well looked after. The second use of animals that are genetically modified is in a process called farming with a PH. Now, farming is where we're going to use these transgenic animals to produce pharmaceutical proteins. So basically, we're going to genetically modify an animal so that they then produce a specific protein for us for some kind of a treatment in their milk. And I've given you two examples there. So we've got AAT in our sheep milk and antithrombin in goat milk. So both of those used in different medical treatments. So in terms of the benefits of this farming, then when the milk is produced, the human protein we need is being produced as well. So we can just extract that particular protein from the milk after we've literally milked the creature. And the other key advantage here of using things like goats and sheep, etc., is that we can produce proteins that are too large to be produced using a bacterium. So what we're able to do is then create much larger proteins, so some of the more complex proteins that we find for human treatments, and therefore we've opened up a wide range of other potential treatments that we can generate those relevant proteins for. The risk, of course, comes back to the animal welfare, but bear in mind, if people are spending the money on these animals to have them genetically modified to produce these human proteins, and obviously those proteins are then going to be able to be sold for profit, they're quite beneficial creatures to have around. These aren't just a random creature in a flock. These are worthy animals. Therefore, they tend to be quite well looked after. The next one for our animals is in food production, and the example I'm giving you here is the genetically modified salmon. Now, we can genetically modify salmon by taking a gene from one particular species and inserting it into another, so that they grow more rapidly throughout the year, even when it's cold. Now, this obviously means that we are going to be able to, as a salmon farmer, sell our salmon for longer periods, and that means more profit. Downsides to these ones, though, is that if these wild salmon were to obviously come into competition with our genetically modified ones, we may very well see the wild populations outcompeted. We could also potentially see hybrids forming from crossbreeding, which could lead to obviously that downside of sharing genes we didn't intend to into those wild populations. So the way we get around that is we only breed females and we make sure they are sterile. Therefore, they wouldn't be able to crossbreed and form the hybrids, and there's only going to be a limited number of them, therefore the outcompeting is also then controlled. If we move on to our plants then, the first example is genetically modified soya. Now, the way that the soya plants have been modified is to be resistant to herbicides. And this means that if we're growing soya plants in a field, that we've got some weeds growing in there as well, competing with our crop, we can just spray the whole field with herbicide, the weeds will be killed, but our soya plants won't. Now, this was actually a little bit of controversy when it first came about, because the company that developed these genetically modified soya plants were the same ones that produced the herbicide. So there was a bit of furore about whether it was just something created to profit that company. The risks of this whole thing, where we're creating obviously a resistance to something, is that we could form superweeds, i.e. we could get some kind of contamination of those weeds with that herbicide resistance gene, and as a result we've got weeds that won't be killed by herbicides. It is worth noting though that even though these plants have been around for quite some time now, we still don't have any evidence that this kind of movement of our resistance genes has happened to wild populations of weeds. The second plant example we're going to look at are the BT plants. So we're talking about BT tobacco, BT maize, BT corn, etc. All of these are being genetically modified to produce a toxin which is made by a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, hence BT. Now, this particular toxin is going to make them resistant to pests. So because the plant is actually resistant to the pest itself, we don't need to spray that field with a pesticide. So obviously, in the grand scheme of things, less pesticide use is better, because that means there's less risk to the small insects in the area, and therefore less risk to the biodiversity. Risks though is that this BT is actually toxic to a type of butterfly called the monarch butterflies. The way we get around this is by only inserting that BT gene into plants that the butterflies don't feed on. So tobacco plants, maize plants, they won't feed on those. They feed on a plant called milkweed. So despite the fact that this has been around now for about 40 years, then we don't see any impact on the monarch butterfly population because they're not feeding on the plant with that particular gene inserted into it. We then come on to another plant example, one that you probably heard about at GCSE, golden rice. Now, golden rice is a type of rice that we've developed to produce beta-carotene. Now, the reason that we're going to be using this beta-carotene gene from daffodils in the rice is because around the world, huge numbers of children are affected by a lack of vitamin A. Now, that's just down to the lack of certain things in their diet that have that beta-carotene available, and therefore, if they don't have the beta-carotene, they can't make the vitamin A, and they're going to suffer with conditions like blindness, for example. So by inserting that beta-carotene gene into the rice, that means that they're getting the actual precursor to that vitamin A in their most staple form of their diet. There is a downside to this though, is that when we're considering the production of genetically modified plants, it's costly. This isn't a cheap process. And therefore there is the consideration that the companies that produce these may be charging higher costs to buy those seeds because they are going to be more expensive. However, it is nice to know that actually the companies that developed the golden rice has offered free licenses to those farmers in the poorer countries of the world so that they can keep and replant those rice seeds, and therefore it's not a case of the cost being inhibitory to them actually getting the benefit. We then come on to our microorganisms, and obviously we've encountered things like the human insulin being made from E. coli, and we can make human growth hormone to treat pituitary dwarfism as well through using bacteria. Now, if we're using microorganisms, one of the key benefits here, aside from the fact that we're making the human proteins, is that we're not seeing those same ethical or religious concerns of using animal products or genetically modified animals in any way. So what we've got with our microorganisms is something that is going to reproduce very rapidly so that we can produce large amounts of our product very quickly, and we don't have those same religious and ethical concerns. The risk to it, as we mentioned in the previous video, is that when we're using these marker genes to transfer those plasmids, then they tend to be things like antibiotic resistance genes. if those marker genes got into a wild population, we'd see an increase in antibiotic resistance, which is obviously bad news if it gets into a pathogen. So, as we mentioned previously, the way that we get around this is by using that gene knockout to ensure that all of these genetically modified microorganisms that we're using in the lab can only survive in the lab. They don't have a gene that allows them to synthesize a particular nutrient that's necessary for their existence. There is one word that we should make ourselves familiar with, bit of a legal term now, patent. So patents are basically legal rights to prevent others from replicating your creation for a certain period of time. So if you develop a genetically modified product, for example, you can take out a patent, and that means that no one else can produce your particular product for X amount of time. The idea being that the company that produced it has a chance to sell it on the market as a single entity and hopefully recoup some of the costs that went into developing that product. Obviously, that does mean that there is no competition for that one company producing it, which can lead to higher prices, because as we know, the more competition there is for a product, then the lower the prices tend to get. As always, I hope you found this video useful, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can see when more videos are uploaded, and then head on over to the website where you can find a range of other resources to help you in your A-level biology studies.